Yay, welcome, and headed for the second day of our collective journey, cultural and political perspectives on psychedelic science. Thanking everybody for a great day yesterday and looking forward for another awesome, peaceful adventure today. And also keeping time. And I want to welcome the moderator, Erik Davies.
Hi there, welcome to this morning's panel. Yesterday was an amazing day, fascinating, rich, dynamic, real stuff, real things. That's great, and I think today will be more of the same. I'm just going to get right to it and introduce our first speaker. I'll introduce people as just before they speak, and then we'll have questions at the end. Amy Emerson is the Executive Director and Director of Clinical Research of MAPS's Public Benefit Corporation, which you heard some about yesterday. She's worked in clinical development and research for quite a while and applies her experience to all facets of MAP's drug development program. And she's going to be talking about possible scenarios for the regulation of MDMA following these phase 3 trials and what's going to happen afterwards. So, Amy.
Good morning. It's like a little bit quieter today, which might be kind of nice. Let me try and get set up here. So, as Erik said, I'm Amy Emerson. I've been working with MAPS since 2003. I worked for about 6 years with Rick to start the clinical development program at MAPS when the very first study started, while I was also working in biotech. So it took about 6 years before we made it far enough along for me to switch over from pharma and move into MAPS work completely. And I feel very grateful and lucky to be able to have done that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we think, or how we know MDMA is kind of regulated and distributed during the phase 3 and then expanded access, which would be in parallel, and then thoughts on what we think post-approval, because we don't know, right? We have to negotiate that. First, I want to start with this quote, which I think comes from a kind of unexpected place. It's the final thoughts in a commentary paper from the Stanford Neuroscience Lab of Rob Malenka. In a paper he wrote with Boris Heifetz, and it was published in Cell in 2016. The world's populations need more compassion and empathy for one another. The study of MDMA provides one small but potentially important step towards reaching that goal. And I would say not just the study of MDMA, but the study of psychedelics in general. And this feels like a message that we can all gather behind and resonate with, even if we come from different viewpoints, and even if we have different paths to this. And so what I'm going to talk about is a path that MAPS and MAPS Public Benefit Corporation have chosen. You heard a little bit from Rick about what a public benefit corporation is. I'm going to tell you a little bit more. It's a hybrid corporate form. It is a for-profit, but it's special because it's empowered to promote a specific public benefit. And this would be a benefit for all stakeholders, including the public, not shareholders. So MPBC was incorporated with a special purpose in mind, and it was in line with MAP's mission. So our special purpose in our incorporation documents is to be a vehicle for conducting MAP's research, to balance social benefits with income from legal prescription sales of MDMA, other psychedelics, and marijuana, which maybe we should change to cannabis. So some of the key attributes of a public benefit corporation that make it different. Oh, I have to push this down. Okay, sorry. I have a Mac. I'm using the PC. It's like confusing for me, I guess. So there's some special attributes. So pursuit of a social objective. So with this, you heard about our anti-patent strategy. That's one of the our social objectives, is to do this in an anti-patent way. And then to focus on social benefit, not profit maximization. So MPBC is what we call MAPS Public Benefit Corporation, or maybe MAPS PBC, you'll hear us use also, is 100% owned by MAPS. So there are no other shareholders to object to using any or all potential funds that might come from commercializing MDMA to be in line with the mission of MAPS. And that money will be constrained to further develop MAPS mission, which is basically the same as the MPBC mission, but with additional emphasis on harm reduction and education. So this also would allow us to put money and become a sustainable nonprofit. If we have profits that are coming in and we do it in line with MAP's mission, then that money will go back into MAPS and PBC and reduce reliance on donations. So it makes us more of a sustainable nonprofit model, which is what ultimately we would like to do, because Rick's been raising money for like 30-some years now. So, and he'll probably never be able to stop, but at least this would be some relief. So there's also a value of increased transparency, and this is with all PBCs, not just ours. But this happened to also be a core value of MAPS. So we will continue to openly share all of our regulatory information, clinical documents, and we will share our data in line with open science principles, which you might be surprised to know actually a lot of big pharma companies are starting to do also, because there's a lot of big data out there that needs to be shared in order to further the development of new drugs and science. We also are developing this qualitative and quantitative measure to ensure accountability to our purpose. So PBCs are only as good as the people that are in them. You can kind of create some kind of self-grading that's very easy to pass. That's not our intention. We do plan to we're working with an ethicist from UPenn, and we're working consistently through developing this. And there are no standards right now for a PBC that works in clinical research. There's also a long-term protection of social benefits and purpose, because it would take a major majority of shareholder votes to change us from being a benefit corporation into a standard corporation. And MAPS is our only shareholder, and they're not going to do that. So I think that this is a really good model for us, and it's a really good way to demonstrate that this can be done in a different way. Now, we know that working within these regulatory pathways that are required for drug development, and this is the path that we've chosen, it can be seen with agreeing with or legitimizing aspects of them that maybe we don't agree with. Like maybe psychedelics should never have been Schedule I in the first place, but they are. So this is the path that we have chosen. And we are heavily involved with the FDA and the DEA, free markets, and capitalism by choosing this path. And there's other ways to do this also, but this is the way that we've chosen. And I think that we also have to support other people taking other paths, maybe towards legalization, decriminalization, whatever those paths are. But we only have, each group only has so much energy to take one path and to move something along. So we believe in these other contexts. There's a lot of work to do. And there's many hands that are needed to do the work. And I hope that everybody will be joining in what they feel is the right way to move this field along. Let's see. I guess another thing that I wanted to say about this is that I'm proud to be part of a group that's chosen this path of public benefit corporations and kind of be paving a way, because it is different than traditional drug development. And I think that we can stand up and do this and show other groups the potential that you can do this in a public benefit corporation way. Maybe all medical development should have a public benefit to it, right? I mean, it's supposed to be for the benefit of the people. And we can do it with transparency. We can do it while supporting open science. And we can create a benefit, and it's okay for profit to still be a part of that. Rick already went over kind of where we're at yesterday, so I'm going to go over this very quickly. But our phase 2 studies are complete. We had promising results. 56% of people in our active dose group showed that they no longer met the criteria for PTSD at the time that we completed the active portion of the study. And when we did the 12-month follow-up, there was an increase in that number. 68% showed that they had continued to improve or at least had sustained improvement. So this allowed us to move forward with our phase 3 program, which we received breakthrough therapy designation for. And we're currently in the open label lead-in part of the phase 3. I think there's people in this room that are participating in that. It's very exciting to be treating people in this. And in September, we should be receiving our drug, and the blinded portion of the phase 3 will start. We'll do 2 phase 3 studies. We still feel like we're on a path to approval by 2021. This will also be followed by a submission to Health Canada, Israel, and then probably within a year of when we do the US approval, we would be looking for one in Europe. And we would also be looking for mutual recognition approvals in a few South American countries, Australia, and we'll be looking for which other countries will accept the data from these other large phase 3s and do something called mutual recognition approvals. So this is our MDMA. This is the synthetic route for our GMP MDMA manufacture. Parts of it are based on the route published by Sasha Shulgin. It was further developed by Dave Nichols to provide MDMA to MAPS for the phase 2 program. It's been further developed by Onyx, who's making our GMP drug, so that it can be completed, the manufacture can be completed at scale for a phase 3 program, and then they'll continue to develop this to scale it up for commercialization. We also work with a vendor called Sharp to encapsulate and package the drug, and that is all, there's a lot of paperwork that goes with it that has to be developed. It's not sitting and with your scale and encapsulating, pills. This is like huge machinery, and every step of the way has to be documented. So at this time, we've made about 1.5 kilos of GMP MDMA, and 450 grams of it were encapsulated this past weekend. Used in our phase 3 studies, stability studies, PK studies. And then we're going to synthesize 5 kilogram batches of MDMA, and those will be used in stability studies, expanded access, and some of that will go into post-approval, and then we'll have to make more. How do you get your hands on this? So we have what we hope will be an expanded access program. So in this program, this would be going along a little bit behind, but in parallel with phase 3. And you have to show the FDA that there's a substantial unmet medical need in order to get approval to do expanded access. You have to show a positive risk-benefit ratio, and you have to show that it will not interfere with enrolling your phase 3 program. I think we can do all of those things. We've already had some conversations with FDA, and I feel pretty certain that when we submit that protocol at the end of this year, that we will probably get approved. There might be a little bit of discussion with them back and forth, but I would say within 2 months of submission that we should have approval. And that the idea would be to start, we already have some people trained for expanded access, and the idea would be to start with small numbers of clinics that are probably outside of our phase 3 sites, so that we can start to work through this program. This might be the largest expanded access program that's fully done under an expanded access IND that's been done. There's GW did one, but they did a lot of, what they did is they had a lot of investigator-sponsored studies that they ended up grouping under expanded access. So this is going to be a very large effort, and it's going to be a slow start, and then we would like to keep adding to it all the way through the time that we have approval, and the idea would be that these clinics would turn into the post-approval clinics, and then more, of course, would be added as people are trained and able to open. This is kind of what an expanded access site could look like. We're looking for sites that have a suitable facility, and that there's a physician that can hold a Schedule 1 license for expanded access. It's still Schedule 1. So you have to get DEA approval to hold a Schedule 1. And then we would need therapy teams that would be working in these facilities. If you want more information on this, it's training@mapsbcorp.com or Ask Maps, and we have sheets that can be given to you that explain a little bit more of the details of this. So we think that MDMA will be regulated in expanded access exactly the way it's regulated in the phase 3 studies. We can only provide MDMA to the sites that do have this Schedule 1 license, and once there's a protocol that's approved by the FDA and the IRB. So if anybody's interested in how you get a Schedule 1 license, you have to have a Schedule 2 through 5 already. You have to go through background checks. The application process includes a local DEA audit, a review by the federal DEA, and review by FDA-controlled substances staff, who then lets us know that a license has been obtained by the Schedule 1 license holder. They can add other people that have background checks and have appropriate credentials to that license, so it can be distributed like during a therapy session without one person having to come back and forth to get it out of the locked cabinet. You have to order using, so once you have that, you can order the MDMA from us using a 222 form, this DEA 222 form. You will have a locked alarmed steel cabinet with a locking bar or a safe. We used to always have safes, but we were able to kind of pull that back a little bit more. We showed that we were very responsible during our phase 2 studies, and we pushed back on the regulations some, because really The regulation is just the steel cabinet, but they had made us have safes before. So we made like a tiny bit of progress. And then the access is only by people listed on the license. And there's lots of paperwork to go with it, as you probably are not surprised to hear that you have to do all this accountability and you should expect audits by the DEA. So this is how MDMA is regulated during phase 3 and during expanded access. One difference in expanded access is that there's a cost recovery component to it. You can't charge for drug and you can't charge participants in phase 3. But during expanded access, you will pay for the drug from us. We don't know what that is yet. I know that will be a question, but we don't know yet. We haven't finished making everything, and we need to figure out what goes into creating that cost. And then also participants will be able to pay. So we won't be paying therapists to do these studies in the way that we do for phase 3. So this is a big thing to figure out within the community, is how this happens in a way that creates access. This gives you a little bit of an idea of how we see. Hold on a second. Now I'm going to see my bar graph a little better. Okay, so right now we are at 2018, and we have about 280 individual therapists trained, and 82 of them are working on our phase 3 study. So that blue bar is the number of people that have entered training. The yellow bar shows how many people are trained and can start with the first participant, and the green bar shows how many people are receiving supervision from our training team. So we're at 288 people trained, 82 people doing phase 3, and 16 people, but I think that number's gone up. It keeps going up every day, that are receiving supervision. By the time we get to 2021, you can see that we have 1,500 people that have entered the training program and 820 people that are providing and getting supervision. And then it keeps growing. By the time we hit 2024, which is a few years after approval, 4,000 people in the training program, 3,300 people providing the service. So, and that will just keep growing. This is just all I can fit on the graph. So how is that MDMA going to be regulated? What's going to be different once we hit after phase 3 and we hit approval? So we'll submit this full phase 3 package to the FDA, hopefully in 2020, so that we can have approval by 2021. And it takes Department of Health and Human Services a rescheduling recommendation. They have to decide what schedule will MDMA be. It will not be Schedule 1 anymore, though we don't know if they will keep ecstasy on Schedule 1 like they did with Xyrem, where they kept that, they rescheduled the prescription drug, but not if it was being used for recreational use. So we don't know. We will do our best to negotiate the best schedule that we can. One of the ways that they figure out the schedule is this 8-factor analysis, which I'm not going to read to you, and you can look it up if you want to. And in fact, there was just a paper that Roland Griffiths was on looking at the 8-factor analysis for psilocybin and what kind of them going through it themselves. The sponsor does need to go through the 8-factor analysis, and so does Health and Human Services. And then they look at both of those and they decide on a schedule. Right now, we think probably Schedule 3. We used to think Schedule 2. We're starting to feel a little more optimistic, maybe Schedule 3. And then once that happens, there's a final ruling, and it's immediately effective, and it has to go into effect within 90 days. That's at the federal level. But then the states, only 50% of the states adopt that rescheduling automatically. And then the other 50% of the states, there's either administrative or legislative action that has to happen. And it's different per state, and we don't know the amount of time it's going to take per state, and this is going to be a lot of work on our part. And we don't know if expanded access can keep going in those states that haven't rescheduled yet, but that's what we will hope for and push for, is that those clinics that are doing expanded access can keep going until they can prescribe. So there's also something you heard about yesterday, and someone asked a question on, was the REMS. It's the Risk Evaluation and Mitigation Strategy. Not all drugs get this, but we're pretty certain that we will. So the REMS it's a specific set of requirements, and each REMS is actually tailored to each medication. And the nature of the risks and the likely setting in which the drug will be used are the considerations for customizing it for that drug. We know that the most likely elements of concern from the agencies will be related to safety and diversion. And we already have these kind of elements built into our program by the very nature of the way that we have set it up. And so from the review of the REMS program, these are the areas. They look at a whole bunch of areas, but the areas that I think are going to apply to us, that they're going to want to talk about, are Is there a specific training and certification in place for providers? Is the dispensation limited and only in approved settings? And is diversion likely? So with the safety piece of it, we can already tell them we have a training program. We will have certifications. There'll probably be a third-party independent certification. There's a movement for that right now, and I think that will be helpful for part of the REMS to have that, be able to discuss that. It's also only administered in a healthcare setting. There's a limited dosing per patient. It's 3 doses, 1 month apart. It's not a take-home. And so I think that this means, though we will have a REMS, I don't think it's likely that they'll make us have a patient registry, which would be great. We don't want to have a patient registry if we don't have to. And then the limiting diversion, which is their other area that I think they'll be interested in. Well, we already have a central distribution that we're thinking of, and we're not even going to go through a pharmacy. It'll be central distribution from the manufacturer directly to the healthcare setting that it's going to be used in, to the Schedule I license holder. And that license holder will have had to have gone through some training. If they're not going to be a therapist, it'll probably be a different training. If the person is a therapist, it'll be the therapist training plus the training in order to receive the MDMA and manage all the paperwork related with the scheduled drugs that you have to do for DEA. And then there'll be we can also let them know that there'd be periodic internal audits. And likely they will also come and audit. So there'll be external audits. I'm done.
Pretty much.
Okay. Well, I think, let me just show this last one. This is how we think it's going to go. We think that in the first year, if we have the number of providers that we mentioned, that we would have about 9.2 kilos of MDMA in the first full year of approval that would be distributed. And then over the 3-year time point, we are assuming it'll go up to about 43 kilos. I only had 2 slides left, or no, 1 slide left, so I'll just end on this one to say that we are going to use healthcare data from the phase 3. We've added some healthcare measures, healthcare utilization type measures that are interesting to insurance companies to help justify coverage. And we would be pushing for new insurance billing codes, and we will also be evaluating other indications that might be high healthcare costs. And that I want to point out that figuring out how to provide this and how to make access is a community discussion. This is like kind of opening the next chapter. Like we get it to a certain point and then it gets turned over to the people that are going to be doing this. And we all have to figure out how, if it's not insurance or if insurance isn't good enough, how do we make this accessible? So I'm going to end with that. Thank you.
Fascinating information, rich talk there. Next, we have Jag Davies, who is the Director of Communication Strategy for DPA, Drug Policy Alliance, where he works to implement healthcare-centered drug policies that support communities, especially those most harmed by the drug war and mass criminalization. He's going to be talking about drug decriminalization, repairing the harms of psychedelic prohibition, which there are more than a few.
Right, good morning. Thanks for coming out bright and early, and to people watching on the live stream, wherever you are. It's really great to be here. Is this mic loud enough? Yep. It's great to be here, and thank you to the organizers. It's as someone who's gone to conferences about psychedelics for about 15 years, it's really good to see how many critical questions are getting asked here, what the potential limitations are of the medical model, about the historical erasure of women and people of color in psychedelic research and in drug policy reform more broadly, and looking at potential models for regulation and community support. And I think we're still just starting to explore a lot of those questions as a community, but it's really great to see that they're at least being asked and more critical questions are being presented. So thank you to the organizers and other speakers here for all of your work. So a little bit about myself. So I've had a bit of an unusual career path. When I was in college, I met the man himself, Rick Doblin, when he was teaching a seminar at New College where I was a student. And in my early 20s, worked at MAPS for a few years from 2003 to 2007, when it was just the psychedelic research, particularly the MDMA PTSD studies were just starting to pick up steam at that point, and the organization needed to grow. So I was at the right place at the right time and was very, very lucky and privileged. But I think my interest, how I came to MAPS was that I've been interested in drug policies more generally, growing up in Miami in the 80s and 90s, where there was heavy police militarization. Saw a lot of my friends, particularly my friends who were not white, getting caught up in the criminal justice system. And, I started to realize that, even in the best case scenario, if MDMA or certain psychedelics get approved to be used in therapy, the vast majority of people who use psychedelics are still going to be using them outside of government-sanctioned, medically supervised settings. And Prohibition is still going to be doing a lot to harm the health and safety of those people. And so I feel like it's incumbent for people who care about psychedelics to work on working to reduce the harms of criminalization outside of medical contexts as a complementary approach to building support for psychedelic-assisted therapy. And it's exciting to see that there's starting to be intersections of drug policy reform and psychedelic research that are starting to be explored more. To give you a bit of background so the past 9 years, I've worked at the Drug Policy Alliance, which is the biggest group in the country working to end the drug war, basically. So that means shifting drug policy as much as possible from a criminalization approach to a health-centered approach. And traditionally, that work has fallen into a few general areas that I'll talk about real quickly before getting into more of the nitty-gritty of psychedelics policy. A lot of that work has focused on marijuana and marijuana legalization. Still in this country, about half of the arrests for drugs, about 700,000 people a year are getting arrested for marijuana. That was as of 2016. Probably the numbers have gone down somewhat since more states passed legalization laws in 2016. But that's out of about 1.5 million people still getting arrested every year simply for possessing a small amount of drugs, which, there's a consensus is is best dealt with through the public health system. And so with marijuana legalization, it's interesting because you hear a lot of people say these days, oh, that's kind of like a done deal, or the industry's already taken it over, and they kind of feeling like a sense of helplessness or inevitability. But this is actually a very critical time when it comes to marijuana legalization, because the devil is really in the details, and our work really now has shifted from not just trying to pass marijuana legalization laws, but to ensuring that it's done with reparative justice and criminal justice reform and racial justice measures included in it. We're running campaigns in New York and New Jersey right now. And actually, I should mention, California was one of the first states that passed marijuana legalization law that did have a number of reparative justice provisions. A certain amount of the tax revenue has to get reinvested in communities that have been most harmed by the drug war. The marijuana possession arrests can be expunged, and they're retroactive, which is very rare with criminal justice reforms for them to be applied retroactively, unfortunately. It's harder to get political support for that. So there's hundreds of thousands of people in California who are eligible now to have their records expunged or their charges in their past reduced, at least, based on the new law. And so at this point, the battle is really about it is almost inevitable that it is going to continue to pass in more states, but the battle is really about how it happens. And so a lot of our battle in New York and New Jersey is with the people from the industry or other groups that are just trying to get a bill passed right away as fast as they can, just to say they did. That's basically a giveaway to the big business interests. But there are good models. I think California's Proposition 64 had some good elements that were a step in the right direction. Massachusetts' law from 2016 also had some good elements. There's a social equity program in it, which Oakland has a social equity program, so that there's licenses, there's requirements that the licensing process has to be open to a diverse range of applicants and given to people from the community who've been most harmed by the drug war. And there's an act in Congress now called the Marijuana Justice Act that has a lot of reparative justice provisions. That's probably not the first one that's going to pass right away, but that's really the battle right now. And I think there's a lot of analogies that can be applied from that to the psychedelics model, because it's a very similar threat that could happen here, where, it's not that hard to envision a future where, psychedelic therapy is legal for people who are more whiter and more well off, where the people who have been harmed the most by prohibition all along are still just as criminalized as they've ever been. I think that there's a lot of analogies there, which I'll come back to. Another big part of our work is around harm reduction and overdose prevention. There's an overdose crisis in the country. Overdose deaths have increased by about 5-fold in the past 20 years in this country. And a lot of that has to do is really a public policy failure. In countries like Portugal that have decriminalized drugs, almost no one dies from a drug overdose. They're almost entirely preventable. Much of the one thing that we're working on in a lot of states is to legalize drug checking. Maryland just became the first state in the country to pass a law to legalize drug checking, which was something our DC office worked on there. But that obviously is for people who care about psychedelics. You might only be interested in, even if you're only interested in using psychedelics, the fact that they're criminalized means that, fentanyl is getting into the MDMA supply. And so unfortunately, because a lot, it's taken this many people dying to start to, for there to be more political support for things like drug checking. But that's moving forward very quickly. In San Francisco, we're on the verge of opening the first supervised consumption service space in the US. And New York City, Boston, Denver, a number of other cities are on the verge of doing that. There's more than 100 sites like that operating around the world. There's decades of evidence showing that it works. But we're in a dangerous moment too, also with the opioid overdose crisis, because it's not just about opioids. Most people who are dying of overdoses have multiple drugs in their system. So just focusing on opioids is not necessarily going to help the problem. And then we also do a lot of work around criminal justice reform more generally. Historically, we've done a lot of work on sentencing reform, and that's gained a lot of support. But in a lot of ways, our work has shifted over the past few years from being about not just mass incarceration, but also mass criminalization. Because if you think about it, there's about 2 million people in prison in the US, but there's 7 million people who are under some form of correctional control and supervision. And particularly with drug possession arrests, even if, a lot of people are in prison, there's more than 100,000 people in prison just for drug possession at any given time. And more than half of them are there just because they're too poor to pay bail. But even then, there's millions of people more cycling through the system every year, whose lives have been derailed. And even if you don't spend a night in prison, once you have a criminal record, it's very hard. Your life opportunities are going to be drastically decreased. As I've been working at DPA, it's been interesting. I've been the first few years I was there, I was kind of waiting. I was assuming that, some group would come along that would be talking more about the criminalization of psychedelics, and and gradually we started doing more work in this area, and it's been really exciting. I guess when I talk about DPA's approach to psychedelics, I would split it into three general areas. One of them is opening up research. Even though there's been a lot of progress that we've been hearing about with getting studies approved through the FDA, having the prohibition system in place still drastically limits research. When you have a law enforcement agency like the DEA in charge of making medical and health decisions about what research goes forward, and then also just like the self-censorship that happens within academia under Prohibition, and it's just much more logistically difficult to do certain types of research. And I think it is quite strategic to focus on the research right now on what will get access to people through the medical system. But that's still, only one angle of research. Ultimately what we're working towards is to, shift decision-making authority over research from the DEA to a health or science agency. We co-published a report with MAPS a few years ago on the DEA's obstruction of science that goes into more detail about this. Another big part of our work is just changing public perception around psychedelics. The interesting thing is, even though there's been all this really positive research over the past few years and a lot of good media, when it comes to like the general public out there, it hasn't changed public opinion of psychedelics very much. And when you think about it, there's a lot of drugs that have medical uses that are approved, by society and by the government, that are also very demonized in other contexts. Adderall and methamphetamine are chemically basically the same drug. And of course, we see the same thing with opioids and with other drugs, where it really depends on the context, and it's oftentimes certain groups are criminalized for using the same drug, depending on whether or not they access it through the medical system or not. A few things I'm really excited about on that front. One is that we have a drug education program called Safety First. A lot of you may have seen, we've been putting out public education materials for years called Safety First. And we finally have an actual high school curriculum that's getting implemented. We ran a pilot program in a New York City high school last year, and there's this fall 3 Bay Area schools that are going to be running this pilot program. It's the first harm reduction based drug education program for teens. The final section in it is on psychedelics, and you may recognize some of the some of the language in it. Another way that we work to kind of change public perception around psychedelics is through something called the Safer Partying Program that's run by my colleague Stephanie Jones. That program works to work with festivals and institutions where people are most likely to use drugs, particularly psychedelic drugs, and have problems with them, either with law enforcement or having difficult experiences due to being in a chaotic situation. So we work very closely with the Zendo project on that, trying to basically scale up the Zendo project and that model. And we work with Insomniac, which is one of the biggest festival promoters in the US, to get them to make sure they have harm reduction information that they're sharing with their attendees ahead of time. And to make that really standard in the festival and nightlife industry, that you should have water, you should have a chill out space, and to promote best practices in that area. And that's, without changing any laws, that's seems like one of the ways to reduce the harms of psychedelics the most, by at least meeting people where they're at in spaces where young people are likely to use them and have difficult experiences with them. Most people age out of using psychedelics. The vast majority of people using them have always been under 30. And that's I think changing very, very slightly, but not that much. So we need to meet people where they're at. And also legalizing drug checking would go a long way in the US towards reducing harms in those contexts. And I should give Dan Safe a shout out, who does excellent work in those contexts. And ultimately, when it comes to psychedelics, it's a small part of the drug war overall. We don't have good statistics on arrests of how many people are getting arrested for psilocybin or psychedelics in a particular place. But it's still if you think about what, who would benefit the most from that, the people who in this room may not benefit as much from decriminalizing drugs. But the people, the young people who are often not white, who are going out to raves and festivals, who are getting arrested, they might benefit more, and they're not in this space. But I think it's also really important to realize that there's not much of a public opinion benefit to separating out psychedelics. So what I would, I think is important is for people who care about psychedelics to support decriminalizing drugs across the board. Very few people only use psilocybin or only use LSD. And so going one at a time isn't really going to be particularly strategic, and you don't actually get a lot of polling benefit from that. I know Ismail is going to talk a little bit about initiatives ahead of time, but after me. But one thing I'll mention is that it's really important when considering whether to do a ballot initiative to make sure that you have your ducks in a row before starting the process. You want to make sure that you have that it's poll tested, the language you want to use, because if you only get 20% support, you're going to make us all look really bad potentially. You want to make sure that you have support from the local policymakers so that it can actually get implemented. You want to make sure you have some funding lined up, so if there's opposition, you're able to fight back against that and not going to end up getting 20% at the polls or something like that. So DPA is working towards potentially doing ballot initiatives over the next decade in several states to implement something like Portugal-style decriminalization. There's a number of countries in Europe that have already decriminalized drugs. Canada's moving towards that. A number of cities and states around the country have taken steps in that direction. So that's kind of the next logical step. And I'll leave it at that and save the rest of the questions. Thank you.
All right, we've heard from some folks who are working with some really powerful and progressive institutions. I'm always happy to acknowledge people who are independent, and our next speaker is Rob Heffernan, who's an independent researcher and activist who's been involved with the Vegetalismo and Santo Daime traditions for almost 20 years. He was a member of an earlier version of the U.S. Santo Daime Legal Committee and served as its chairman for a period. He's an Ayahuasca Defense Fund and Chacruna Associate and a certified breathwork facilitator, sound healer, and practitioner of Buddhist Dhamma. He works in the AV IT industry. So, Rob.
I'd like to thank Shakruna and Bia for inviting me to speak, and especially like to thank Bia for her encouragement over the past couple of years to have me come out from behind the scenes and get in front of the room and speak and write about these issues. It's hopeless to try to do justice to my topic in 20 minutes. I could literally speak for 20 or 30 minutes about just about every sentence I'm about to say, and that's not only because I tend to be verbose. After listening to yesterday's session, I wanted to further revise and add even more material, but what I'm going to do is make a series of observations and then focus on one group that's emblematic of certain legal and social issues, and then shift the focus to a number of groups who exemplify a different set of possibilities. I also want to acknowledge that it's well known that ayahuasca can be frightening, even terrifying. And for me, speaking about ayahuasca in front of people at symposiums like this can sometimes be just as frightening. So if I stumble over my words and go into an existential crisis in front of you, just bear with me. Given the special nature and history of ayahuasca use in this country, I'm going to be focusing on spiritual and religious freedom. Yet, myself, like most of us here, like most of us here, I feel that people should be able to use ayahuasca and other psychedelic medicines more or less as they feel called to and with whom they feel called to. That will necessitate a radical revision of the Controlled Substance Act, a law which has imprisoned many people, destroyed lives and opportunity, wasted resources, and which disproportionately affects people of color. While that's outside the scope of my talk, I wanted to acknowledge that my inquiry is nested within that broader issue. Looking at the legal challenges and opportunities of ayahuasca as a lens into many other issues and concerns beyond law, including ethics, the safety and well-being of participants and communities, ideas about knowledge, structure, power, economics, colonial, neo-colonial, extractivism, and appropriation, and why we use these sacred magical substances to begin with. Again, I can't really address all those topics, but I want to acknowledge that they're in there. There's still quite a bit of confusion about the legal status of ayahuasca in our country. At the present time, there are two groups that can legally use ayahuasca in the U.S., the União de Vegetal, or UDV, and some branches of the Santo Daime. They both won court cases and or applied for and received legal exemptions from the DEA under a law called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Yet, there are a number of groups which publicly promote their ceremonies online and either claim that they are legal or in some cases that they're more or less legal. To a great degree, these claims are due to a national organization called the Oklevu Native American Church, also known as ONAC. They are not really a Native American church. They've created an intricate legal fiction which they use to sell memberships and branches online. They maintain that if you're a member, you can legally use ayahuasca, peyote, cannabis, and a number of other substances, and if you're a branch, you can legally serve them. Many people have literally bought into this fiction, and by the way, they do that by the intricate legal fiction they've made is by mischaracterizing and a number of laws and court cases. Many people have legally bought into this fiction, and while being critical of ONAC, I do recognize that any given group associated with them may be in fact made up of good people doing good work. I know a number of them, but still there's this delusion about them being legal. But why do people believe this fiction? For one thing, the government is not arresting or shutting down any groups that are promoting themselves openly. This is the case even when deaths have occurred. There have been 2 deaths in ayahuasca retreats in the U.S. During the past few years. Ayahuasca itself was not involved. One involved combo when a person drank too much water, flushing the sodium and essential minerals out of their body, which resulted in a deadly seizure. The other involved someone slipping and hitting their head after an ayahuasca work was over, resulting in a traumatic brain injury that led to their death. It was a freak accident. Both these situations could have been an opportunity for the government to go in and shut them down, but they didn't. The government doesn't seem to want to pursue or prosecute ayahuasca for a number of reasons. They lost 2 major court cases, a unanimous Supreme Court decision that recognized the right of the UDV to use ayahuasca, and a district-level decision that recognized the Santo Daime's right to do the same. Both created precedents for other groups to use. The government seems to recognize that ayahuasca is different from other controlled substances. There's little to no, quote unquote, recreational use. And by the way, I, like others, have an issue with that term. Recreation can be profound as well as pleasurable. And the government can see there's not much trafficking or big sums of money involved in its use. It's connected with spiritual and healing traditions in the Amazon and other places in South America. People use it to overcome addictions and trauma, including veterans, and not too many people are ending up in emergency rooms due to ayahuasca use. So it seems the government knows that using resources to find and prosecute a rainforest medicine is not high on their agenda. There's the curious dynamic of Jeff Sessions' directive to the Justice Department to be very circumspect about prosecuting cases involving religious freedom. This is part of the tactic of right-wing conservatives to use the framework of religious freedom to defend discrimination against LGBT people and others, yet this dynamic seems to help ayahuasca groups. It's a stark paradox that creates strange bedfellows. And in fact, there was a piece published earlier in the year on BIA's website about this by the lawyer Charles Carrion, and I wrote a synopsis of it on Chacruno. So I want to take a moment to speak about the word churches, actually. There are numerous groups incorporating themselves as ayahuasca churches, and some people have an issue with the idea of a church and the term. The term comes from the Greek word ecclesia, which means assembly, congregation, council. Fundamentally, you can see its meaning as a congregation of those who come together in community to celebrate, understand, be inspired, to practice a path together, to connect with spirit, however one might understand that. It's not just a Judeo-Christian institution or building. You don't need to use the term, but you don't have to be afraid of the term either. Just as a personal note, my core, while I'm deeply involved with ayahuasca, the Vegetalismo tradition, and Santo Daime, my core spiritual path is Buddhist Dhamma, and I sometimes describe myself as a mystical scientific materialist and an atheist who believes in God. So there's room under the religious tent for a lot of diversity. While the government does not seem intent on pursuing or prosecuting ayahuasca, that doesn't mean there aren't problems or arrests. There's been at least 3 arrests in the within the last year that I'm aware of, 2 at the border when people were bringing in the medicine, and another recent one about 2.5 months ago when a woman was arrested after receiving it in the mail. She didn't receive her medicine, so she made an inquiry. This led to 30 law enforcement officers invading her house. She's been charged with possession of 2.5 kilograms of DMT with intent to sell. They just weigh the whole plant substance and say it's all DMT. She's under house arrest with an electronic bracelet. She can't leave even to get food, much less go to work or go outside. Needless to say, this is taking a great emotional toll and spiritual toll on her. I'm in contact with her constantly, and a lot of the work I'm doing with her is actually spiritual counseling. There's good signs that things are taking a turn towards it being a deferred prosecution, but there's roadblocks and red tape involved. We may need to start a GoFundMe for her and take this case public, and so we'll need your support and assistance in that. And there might be more about that to come. I'm also aware of some cases of the Child Protection Services getting involved with ayahuasca using groups. In one case, a child was forced to live with another relative for a couple months, and the parents had to spend $50,000 on lawyers. In the end, the outcome was good, but needless to say, it was traumatic to the child and the family. So people need to be aware that that we can't be complacent, even though the government isn't particularly pursuing ayahuasca, that there are risks, especially on the local level, and this gets compounded if people are using a variety of other substances, even legal ones like hape and kambo, which are not well understood by the community at large. I want to talk now about 2 groups that are emblematic of legal issues and cultural issues and trends in ayahuasca circles. The first is a group called Soul Quest, or Soul Quest Church of Mother Earth. It was founded 4 years ago by Chris Young, soon after he had his first powerful experiences with ayahuasca. He felt he was directed by the medicine to begin a church and bring it more broadly to people in the United States. He quickly began that endeavor by becoming associated with the group I mentioned earlier, the Oklavu Native American Church. He opened a branch, bought property, and began promoting and marketing his ceremonies online, claiming to be a legal indigenous Native American church. Myself and others questioned his claims, and eventually he began to see that ONAC didn't afford him legal protection. Yet due to his public promotion and marketing, a local TV station did an investigative report on them, which drew the attention of the DEA. They sent SoulQuest a letter informing them that they were in violation of the Controlled Substance Act and invited them to get an exemption. Note that they didn't shut them down, much less come and seize their medicine or threaten immediate arrest. SoulQuest has now submitted an exemption request. It was about a year ago. They haven't ruled on it yet. I've had many discussions and arguments with Chris over the years. I've told him that I didn't think he should have started his church, that he should pause or abandon it for further study, contemplation, and training. Yet over time, I have to say I'm beginning to develop a begrudging respect and admiration for their determination, courage, and commitment. They've provided a means to experience ayahuasca for people that might find it hard to do otherwise. Many people feel they've had powerful and positive experiences there, including veterans with PTSD, though others have been disappointed and critical of their venture, including past facilitators there. So I've moved from having negative to mixed feelings about them, yet I still have quite a few concerns and questions. If you go to their website, you can see that they operate on a business model. They look like an alternative healing center offering a menu of options, ayahuasca retreats being primary among those options. They seem akin to healing retreat centers in South America offering ayahuasca also on a business model, which isn't necessarily a problem. It's a practical model that many of us have taken advantage of. Yet, is this actually a church? Is it a spiritual congregation? Will it meet the Myers criteria that the government uses to help evaluate whether a group is engaged in a bona fide religious practice? When you have a business model in real estate, you need to fill seats on a constant schedule. How does that affect the group size, the kind of spiritual practice offered, screening and follow-up? Or we could say, how does the marketing affect the Merisao and the Davies when the medicine opens up realms of deep insight, visionary expanse, absorption into and dialogue with the divine, the elemental, the archetypal? When you have a business model, how does it affect things like that? These are questions that apply to other groups and individuals that are openly promoting themselves or have semi-private Facebook pages that are easy to access. Some of these groups and individuals are located in one place, some travel around the country, and some do both. SoulQuest and some of these other groups also claim to be, as I mentioned before, indigenous Native American churches. They rationalize this through some convoluted thought process, yet it's certainly not true. They're not part of any specific or coherent indigenous tradition. They certainly aren't the Native American Church. It seems to be a legacy of being involved with ONAC and a means to claim legal and spiritual legitimacy. Needless to say, indigenous groups in the actual Native American Church are angry about these claims and the appropriation of their name and culture. So I want to contrast this with a very different model I want to contrast this with a case of a number of other groups who follow a very different model. While they're distinct, they're also interwoven with one another. This includes a group in the Shipibo tradition, the Vegetalismo tradition, the Umbanda Daime tradition, and the classical Daime tradition. Each is very discreet with no public promotion involved. In some cases, they're also very circumspect about what they actually put in their emails. They don't operate on a business model. They would exist whether 5 or 25 or 250 people were interested in coming. They look for ways to make their works affordable, their ceremonies affordable, and in the case of the Daime, it's always been the tradition that no one is turned away for lack of money. They have legal counsel, in some cases the same legal counsel. They're incorporating their groups as churches. They follow the protocols that are set forth in the court cases as much as possible, and they're getting their houses in order and ready to seek exemptions if the time seems ripe and appropriate. They have careful screening, they engage in various forms of follow-up and integration, and most importantly, they counsel together to discuss areas of concern and support, which includes issues of legal issues, safety, integration, finances. They discuss if people with mental health problems are attempting to go from one group to another, one church to another, and how these people can be included in community and supported without being given more than a homeopathic dose of the medicine. They're engaged in looking to reach out to other groups and to form formal and informal associations. And while they have distinct practices and traditions, they also sometimes sit in each other's ceremonies, and in some cases have close relations with the Native American Church. There's there's numerous groups across the country which mirror what those particular groups are doing in many ways. So the key takeaway here is how communities can support one another in addressing legal issues, health and safety, and the broader cultural and political issues that have been presented in this conference, and to do so by associating together on the local, regional, national, and international levels. So I'll ask you to please talk to me more and ask me questions about such initiatives. Bea and myself are just beginning to brainstorm about the role that Chacruna can play in that. So let's link up our various efforts that we're already engaged in, and let's find a way to agree on best practices and guidelines to self-regulate before the government attempts to regulate us in more draconian ways. And I spoke so fast, I'm probably ahead of time. Okay.
Thanks, Rob. All right, our last speaker for the morning is Ismail Ali, JD, who works at as Policy and Advocacy Council for MAPS, and also serves as the chair of the Students for Sensible Drug Policy on the Board of Directors, and is licensed to practice law in the state of California. So he's going to be he's giving us a reflection on the initiatives to regulate psilocybin mushrooms and Ibogaine in the U.S., which are going to become pretty hot button real fast.
Good morning. Can everyone hear me? Do you mind if we start with a little bit of breathing? Can we just close our eyes and put our feet on the ground? Just a moment. Maybe take a moment to reflect on the people, concepts, structures, systems that facilitated us being here today, and on the complexity and nuance of these super significant topics that we've been covering over the last couple of days, and really for much longer than that. I just want to appreciate that, because part of what I'll be talking about today is reflection on the future. And I think in order to do that, to have an effective reflection of the future, we have to have an awareness of the past. Thank you. I also did that because although I have written about this topic, I wrote an article also for Chacruna about a year ago called A New Era of Psychedelic Policy, which I welcome anyone to take a look at, which will cover some of the topics that I'll cover today. And my favorite part of this talk, this piece, is the first word, reflections, because it gives us a chance, and I think gives me a chance in this talk, to look at what's been going on, to provide a basic overview, to give some details about what specific efforts have been made to create legal access to these substances that in a non-medical context, or sometimes hybrid medical context, and then to think about what we can do as a community and into the future to impact access in the longer run beyond any singular system. So a tiny bit of background about who I am. Like Jag, I was also in the right place at the right time. I grew up in Fresno, California. My parents are both immigrants. My mom came from Colombia. My dad came from Pakistan. I grew up in California and then came up to the Bay Area to go to law school in Berkeley in 2013. And it happened right after, I came to school here right after my mother passed away. 5 weeks after my mother passed away, I came up here. So the last 5 years for me have been this really interesting overlap of developing knowledge and experience in the law and the way that the law and policy works in this country. Plot twist, it doesn't. And also how these systems and these medicines, these plant medicines, these sacred substances, these incredible molecules have impacted my life and the life of my family. So a lot of this is really personal to me, and I think a lot about what we have to do to get people like my family, immigrants, refugees, people who come from other contexts who don't have the same framework, who don't have the same reliance on science or any of these other systems to actually be into and interested in access. So the fact that we're having this conversation is a major sign of the times. And my own perspective is that we need to create safe and legal access by any means necessary. I'm just kidding. I actually don't believe in any means necessary thinking. And I think by any means necessary thinking kind of misses the point, because the process by which we do something impacts the outcome, and that is the ultimate reflection of it. Yesterday, Bia mentioned that the setting from set and setting isn't just the setup of the room itself, but also the creation of existence of a culture in which these substances can be used in ritual or sacramental or non-biomedical or biomedical frameworks. And that, again, is what we're really talking about. The creation and existence of a culture in which these substances can be used responsibly and intentionally and with integrity. So that means that as we think about how to create safe and legal access, the means at which we do that is a reflection of the process we follow to achieve it, and that process impacts the actual methods by which people experience the experience. So for instance, just to back up a little bit, the present conversation that I'm hearing about capitalism, and by extension, whiteness, and other systems of oppression is seen most visibly through the portal of medicalization and healthcare, the point of entry that's most visible for most of us. This is in large part because of the framework of scheduling, drug scheduling, the Controlled Substances Act, the way that these treaties have worked internationally, which has placed us in a situation that requires heroic efforts by scientists, researchers, and therapists to bring to light Western scientific evidence that some specifically vetted substances have a demonstrated medical benefit under one regulatory scheme, the US FDA, and hopefully a whole bunch of others. But because we're starting from a point framework of criminalization of that Jag and a lot of others have really accurately described, that begins at the point that there's no medical use, begins at the point that there's harm, we have to necessarily respond to that in order to move forward. We're starting from really far back. We're really not starting from a baseline here. And I think that that helps place some of the context around why we focus so much on some conversations and less on others. So the conversation about medicalization seems dominant at this time, but how we define medicalization is limited in scope by its very nature, and how we think about medicine can change. And in fact, I would say that it already is. So it's also true that other points of access, like moving legalization forward through legislation versus initiatives, which I'll discuss today, carry other or different implications than medicalization, which I think can help frame it in a larger context, which seems really important at this time. So I'm gonna give a little bit of a basic understanding of what happened with cannabis legalization, because although there are a lot of elements of what happened with cannabis that are currently happening with cannabis that are not applicable, I think, to the way that psychedelics will ultimately be regulated, I think there's some of the timeline that could be helpful to know. So to start, there was a 20-year period between 1996, which was when Prop 215 was passed, which legalized medical cannabis in the United States, and 2016, in which Proposition 64 was passed, which legalized it for adult use. I also have some beef with the issue, the recreational term, although I love recreation. So it's just the terminology does matter here. And so that 20-year period was a time in which significant other legislative efforts occurred, and initiatives occurred over the course of the country, over the course of the world, that started shifting policy. But before 1996, before Proposition 215, there was a whole other kind of process of getting us to that first point. I kind of see where we're at right now somewhere in like the 1992 range. I don't think we're at the point where we can start like legalizing stuff at the state level, and I will talk again a little bit more about that in a bit. But I do think that we're at the point where in the late 80s, when you had especially HIV positive and gay activists that were really focusing on what would it take to legalize medical marijuana in the state of California. And I heard a lot of this in Brian Anderson's talk yesterday around the organization of people who were impacted that would benefit from the medical use, and them really coming together to create a united front for the pharma system and look at how they could change that. And I think that we're kind of at this point where we're transitioning from the really esoteric brainstorming stuff, where it's like, wow, this stuff could happen in the future, this stuff could happen in the future, to this is definitely going to happen in the future, and we really need to figure out the logistics because it's getting really messy really fast. And again, looking at cannabis, you can see that if we don't really intentionally think about all the nuances of the way that the system actually works, not just how we want it to work, that we could end up in a position in 5 years or 10 years that we have to pull back on a bunch of stuff that we thought was really good, thought would be really helpful, but isn't. So in 1996, California voters passed Proposition 215, which made our state the first in the union to allow for the medical use of marijuana, and that's medical use in a separate state scheme that's independent from the FDA, which is important, and I'll come back to that in a second. And since then, 30 more states, including DC, or plus DC, Guam, and Puerto Rico, have enacted similar laws. So there's a lot of places where there are medical, non-FDA-based schemes in the United States for cannabis. And in January 2018, earlier this year, the Vermont legislature passed adult use legalization legislation. So we went from mostly initiatives, mostly people-run initiatives in states to do medical, to now in 2018 having a state legislature actually passing an adult use marijuana law. That's a pretty significant arc, and DPA and a lot of other organizations have had put a lot of energy and time into making that possible, to really destigmatizing, to normalizing and normalizing the stuff that happens on a more cultural, kind of esoteric level that isn't necessarily quantifiable besides maybe by polls, but that is an absolutely necessary process of having not just legal access, but the cultural context that can hold it responsibly. So I want to just list off characteristics of regulated systems and regulated cannabis systems, and see if y'all can extrapolate a bit about what that would look like for psychedelics. So some of the characteristics of a system that we have now that currently exists for the regulation of marijuana include the protection from criminal penalties. That seems kind of baseline. It really is baseline. I'll come back to that also. Another is access to marijuana through home cultivation, dispensaries, or other regulated or semi-regulated systems. And that's like a big arc. We can probably feasibly think about what it might look to have homegrown mushrooms, or homegrown wachuma, or homegrown substances. It'd be a little bit more difficult to think of like a homegrown MDMA lab. That's like a little bit outside of the framework that we're looking at. We're like, how many people are going to be able to extract Ibogaine from Iboga? They're going to have to find the root. Like, so there necessarily kind of a difference in systems that are going to have to occur. And I don't want to knock or condone any of them at this point, because part of the other piece of this is that each of these substances, because of the way they work, are going to require different systems. They're going to require different regulatory systems, and some may be totally hands-off, treated like tomatoes. And some may require a little bit more framework, not necessarily because we should or ought to criminalize people who behave outside of that framework, but because in order for us to responsibly bring forward these substances into the world, this opportunity that we have in the West to now for the first time steward access to psychedelic substances in this way, to do so in a way that actually impacts and benefits the most amount of people without kind of continuing the same, perpetuating the same systems of oppression that prevent people from getting access in the first place. So another piece of it is that they allow a variety of strains with various levels of THC and other qualities. In other words, the diversity of the cannabis experience is respected and given space for. Diversity of the experience is respected and given space for. And then, of course, various forms of ingesting. I thought this was really funny when I saw this on this list that I looked up. But you can smoke it, you can vaporize it, you can eat it, you can drink it, you can take tinctures. You have a lot of options for how you put cannabis in your body in legal systems. And although, again, there are only so many ways you can do certain substances, the idea of, again, respecting the diversity of experiences and having space for that that's legally protected is really, really important. So even without going deeper, just replacing those concepts with various psychedelics doesn't sound so bad. Like, there's some things there that clearly do need some additional support, they need some additional intentionality, but ultimately we can see that with a substance like marijuana, which for so many years was so demonized, which had so many harms in society, is actually kind of chill. Like, the process of bringing it out is pretty chill. Obviously, there's a lot of mess with the regulations and stuff, which again, I'll get back to. But ultimately, the reality is that we're not seeing massive social collapse now that marijuana is legal. And that's really nice for those of us who've been saying that. There's plenty of people here who've been saying it as long as I've been alive. So the question I think to ask is, when will we have the first state, the first kind of jurisdiction with medical or fully decriminalized use of any psychedelic? Will it be psilocybin? Will that fold into all drug decriminalization? And I think that before answering that question, as we all know, and as Attorney General Jeff Sessions will not let us forget, at the federal level, marijuana remains classified as a Schedule I substance under the Controlled Substances Act, where Schedule I substances are considered to have a high potential for dependency and no accepted medical use, making distribution of marijuana a federal offense. So that's kind of a damper, and he is also kind of bluffing. So we're in this interesting place where it is true that the federal government can continue to restrict marijuana systems, legal marijuana systems, but due to a series of agreements that have been made between the Attorney General in the past and other state governments, there seems to be a relative protection or a relative kind of hands-off nature of how state-level cannabis initiatives are working. That, however, and the point I'm making here is that that's not a guarantee. That's something that occurs because there are agreements in place, but they could feasibly be shifted, and there's nothing to stop the federal government to continue to enforce certain laws as it has in the past, even during the Obama administration, even during other medical schemes. So I say that because there are systems of protection that exist that are based in agreements, and then there are legal protections that would prevent, in theory, of course, prevent the federal government or other government actors or law enforcement from actively engaging in repressive tactics. So there's a significant differentiation there, which I think is relevant when we're talking about FDA protection versus like a state initiative protection, which are actually different in that sense. So because regarding psychedelics, there's no reason to believe that any changes in state or local law that violate federal law would be totally left alone by an unsympathetic attorney general. Legislators trying to violate federal law by doing the same thing are also playing with fire, and initiatives are no more secure. So before going into any details, all of these methods of legalization, of creating points of access, are not actually that secure. And that's, I think, part of the reason there's a resistance to thinking about other options beyond medicalization, because none of those other ones, besides like actual federal advocacy and shift to the federal level, would provide sincere protection. And it would be very difficult for, I think, a lot of practitioners, for therapists, for people who are working with vulnerable populations to promise protection when they can't do that. So there is something to be said for creating these federal systems of protection that actually build in systems that prevent the federal government and other agencies from engaging in ways that are oppressive. And there's got to be a gray area, right? There's got to be something in the middle that we can agree on. So what options do we have here? What I'm going to do now is describe pretty straightforwardly what's been happening with respect to legislation and initiatives in the United States, and then kind of go from there into some possibilities of like what we might want, what we might be actually looking for. So for some reason, there's been this interesting split where all the attempts to regulate Ibogaine so far in the United States, not including FDA process, have occurred through legislation. And for some reason, all of the attempted initiatives, or all the attempts at regulating mushrooms and psilocybin have occurred through initiative. So that, I don't really have a strong analysis or clear example of that, but there's a few things that we can see in exactly what attempts were made that might kind of help illuminate that. So with Ibogaine, we have 3 states, New York, Maryland, and Vermont, in 2015, 2016, and 16-18, respectively, that have attempted to pass legislation to create Ibogaine access treatment centers. In New York, the law was to encourage, aid, and facilitate clinical research into the use of Ibogaine. So we're talking federal funds being allocated to do clinical research with Ibogaine. In Maryland, it was an Ibogaine treatment pilot program to provide Ibogaine treatments at participating health facilities to opioid-dependent individuals. So looking at health facilities that already exist, and then adding systems of Ibogaine treatment at those to people who are opioid dependent, specifically to evaluate the effectiveness of Ibogaine treatment. So that's not quite drug development, but it is a qualitative framework that's meant to see the impact of Ibogaine on this particular population. That's in Maryland. And then in Vermont, there was an attempt to pass a grant within the Department of Health to study the effects of Ibogaine as a treatment for opioid dependency. It's actually kind of vague. It could be to conduct clinical trials. It could be to do pilot program stuff. But I guess what we're seeing, and that was in Vermont. So I guess what we're seeing in these attempts is like this quasi-medicalization framework that still takes the medical model and then like tries to insert it in the states in various ways, again, circumventing the larger structures, not necessarily the FDA, but possibly kind of circumventing the structures to develop their own kind of data collection process. And that's really interesting for Ibogaine because, as Rick was saying yesterday, like in the process of litigation in the early 90s, there hasn't been a very strong cohesive attempt at re-regulating Ibogaine or attempting to do that in the US that has really taken off yet. So we could very easily, I think, see that shifting, and especially with this around what Jag was saying, where there's so much attention on opioids and opioid dependency, I think it's very likely and plausible that more and more legislators, by the way, these are from different parties, so it wasn't just Republicans or Democrats, it was fairly bipartisan on I think all of them. So it's something that's impacting enough people, and there's enough attention to it that these legislators are realizing that there might be a reasonable an important and now timely excuse, I guess, to start studying this at the state level. So with psilocybin, like I said, these have all gone forward or attempted to go forward with citizen initiatives. I'll start by talking about California, because I never in my life, literally never in my life, thought I'd be saying that I'm glad the psilocybin decriminalization initiative didn't get on the ballot in California, because I even 2 years ago would have said any progress in that direction toward more legalization, more decriminalization is a good sign. And although I hold that in my heart, I think that ultimately the California psilocybin decriminalization initiative was not the best way forward. And I'm, again, can't believe I'm saying this, grateful that it didn't make it on the ballot, because I think there are a lot of other pieces that need to get in place before something like that can move forward. Like I said, I don't think we're in 1996 yet. I don't think we can just start legalizing any single psychedelic at the state level, not because I don't want to or believe it's impossible, but believe that in order to do that with integrity, there are a lot of pieces that have to get put in place and community that has to be developed that hasn't really fully articulated itself yet, at least not in public. So that initiative in California would have exempted 21 and over adults from criminal penalties and decriminalized the adult use of psilocybin. And it didn't receive enough signatures. We heard probably about 6 weeks ago or so, maybe a month ago, that it didn't receive enough signatures to be on the ballot for this year. And I'm grateful for that. And I think that one of the interesting lessons from this process was that the person who ran the initiative has repeatedly for many years said and done many things over a lot of mediums, including Twitter, to offend a lot of people, and has said some really hateful things. And I think that the way that the people who represent the community, who represent these initiatives, go forward in our public perceived does matter. And it pains me to say that, but it's true. And the fact is that we are fighting a lot of stigma in a lot of different directions, and there does take this weird quasi professionalism kind of hybrid strategy of understanding how people are thinking about this in order to respond to them effectively. There's also an attempt at passing a state-level initiative in Oregon in 2020. That's a little bit different. It's a little bit closer to what the Prop 215 kind of medical model looks like with caretakers. And unfortunately, because it looks kind of like an FDA-approved model but isn't, it kind of falls in this really uncomfortable gray area where it looks like it's trying to regulate in the way that the federal government might, but it's not actually doing that, which I think can and almost certainly will cause serious conflict. And I think in order for something like that to go forward or to be effective or even legal for the state of Oregon to do, a lot more efforts are going to have to be put in place to kind of dive into that. And if you have questions about that, please ask, because Jag and I both have talked about this a lot and would be happy to give more details. And another example, which I think is a little bit more viable, although still challenging, is in Denver, to actually decriminalize psilocybin just in the city of Denver. And although there are a lot of issues with this as well, I do think that if we're going to be thinking about highly experimental ways of doing single drug decriminalization, which may not even be the best route, that doing it at the city level or in a smaller jurisdiction does make sense, because it would give a way to start collecting very, very, very limited and basic but significant data on how that affects the population, if at all. So I think I have about 5 more minutes or so, a little bit less than that, 3.5. I'm going to go 4. So in the last few minutes, I'm going to go over some analysis and structural critiques and big concerns of what some of the things I just shared. And I mentioned some of them around the systems that we're looking at and the way that these imperfect systems, whether it's going through legislation, which necessarily requires persuading representatives, so people who are bound to be voted and who have a certain responsibility to their constituents. And then there's the way of going for initiatives, which is a people-run, very expensive process of a ton of public education. There's kind of pros and cons to these different routes, but the point is that we have options, and that part of what's happening with this attention toward these new kind of options for legalization or for decriminalization for some progress means that people are getting more creative. And ultimately, I think that the net benefit of this becoming a public conversation is that people are getting more creative, and we're able to get more critical about what's going wrong. I was joking a lot yesterday. I'm actually really grateful to see a lot of the tension, and I wouldn't even say conflict, but the kind of the expansion of the conversation that's happening here, because it means that we're now big enough and significant enough to have a diversity of opinions, which we really desperately need, not only because it's good for us as a culture and us as a movement, but because in order to show to the public, to the world, whoever they are, that this is a legitimate process, there has to be a self-accountability process, a mechanism for self-accountability, and a lot of that is happening in these discussions. So one big theme that I want to really like put glitter on and like neon lights and stuff is that we don't want to fight for policies that will have to change later. It's really optimistic. It's like painfully optimistic. We don't want to have to fight for policies that will have to change later. And I think we can look at lessons from cannabis to really like highlight that. We're seeing a lot, there was so much good faith and good intention, and there remains a lot of that in the cannabis movement and industry. But the reality is that because of certain large structural systems, capitalism and others, we are existing in a framework in which the way that industry, that business, that these larger structures, that government, that regulations work, it's not really just one actor or another. That the way that the systems work in tandem has made it very, very difficult for a lot of the benefits of legalization to happen and be evenly distributed between all people. So because we know that different substances need different systems, sacramental systems, medical systems, same or both or beyond, we have to think about how do we legally protect the intentional use of these substances for whatever purpose, which necessarily requires a larger framework than just business or just government regulation or just any of these others. So general recommendations to start, we have a baseline of decriminalization, which means no criminal penalties for good faith intentional use. No criminal penalties for good faith intentional use. And I would go further and say no criminal penalties for use, period. I think that it's important to name the value of good faith intentional use, because I think that that allows us to build in systems of accountability, even if only in language, in the way that we move this forward. But that does not need to be done through coercion and force like most every other law is enforced. Whenever people ask what to do, and I was just speaking at UC San Diego with my colleague Natalie and a few other people, and I'm frequently asked, what can we do? What can young, especially like young people, I work with SSDP, like what can young people do, and what can people do to move these forward in a way that isn't like be a researcher or be a therapist? What else can we do? And the number one thing I always say is to fight for safe consumption sites, or as they're starting to call it, overdose prevention sites, which is a weird semantic thing. But I believe that if we can protect the most vulnerable people, we can protect ourselves. It's not a big step from protecting injection drug users to protecting normal use of psychedelic substances. So I think that if we start with the people who are most stigmatized, which can be done by building in these measures into legalization or into these processes, and I think weirdly the opioid overdose epidemic is actually causing a rehumanization of some drug users. So I think that this like really reverse upside down world process that we're in 2018 is actually going to be working in the favor of this movement as a whole, even as it takes lives as we go. So I think that it makes sense to continue to use the FDA process to medicalize some substances. Like I said, like an MDMA homegrown does not really make sense. So I think there might be some reasons to have these structures. LSD, even though we have like this giant cultural trauma in the United States around LSD, I think it would be a good candidate for FDA approval, not on patent, of course. And I do think that we have to have a conversation in this medical kind of framework around Ibogaine and Psilocybin, and to the extent that it's bioprospecting, to the extent that it's neocolonialism, and to the extent that where the funds go, where the profit goes, when we're talking about the systems of access, does actually impact the communities that they come from. And I think that there are a lot of options for regenerative, transitional, post or transitionary capitalist economies that we're not fully articulating, that I think we're really seeing with the Public Benefit Corp, and I think we really can see with a lot of other options moving forward. I know I'm done. I'm going to be given like 9 more seconds. Thank you. I think we should keep utilizing the courts to fighting for sacramental use, which Rob really touched on super awesomely earlier. And I'll say that I think that for these other options, through the people, the representatives, the initiatives, through the legislature of the masses, really looking at all drug decriminalization and the idea that criminal penalties should not exist for what you put in your body, period, as a starting point. And from there, letting the natural, community accountable, hyper-local, like systems of integrity kind of build themselves out. And I think that's happening a lot. It's kind of like, again, what Brian said yesterday around like having therapists organize themselves, having people with PTSD organizing themselves, looking at the people who are going to be impacted and supporting their organization process, because ultimately they're the ones that should be driving this. Lastly, I just want to say, talk about community. And let's see, that there's one of the things that Jag also mentioned is this changing demographic of psychedelic drug users. It's really not just people in parties anymore. And in order to make these changes, we need support from local policymakers. And I think there's a connection to these things. There's changing demographic of drug users, expanding demographic of drug users, people in a lot of different places and a lot of different perspectives. And at the same time, we need local support and community in order to make local change. I think that the overlap here is to as we bring in people to the conversation, to not just teach people and educate them, that's a huge part, but it's also to build the community that can hold these changes at the state, local, federal level as we move forward. We really do need to have and build a culture that can hold these spaces, because if not, we'll have really good language in a bill that cannot be implemented because we don't have the structures of community in order to do that. So a lot of that is already happening in the underground. I urge and I'm excited about the process of bringing that overground. Because the definition of medicine is changing and the barriers between different systems, spirituality, medicine, et cetera, and healing are beginning to blur, which is what psychedelics do. I think that these efforts to build community will lead to other more creative possibilities outside of the current options that we have, whether it's medical or state or whatever else.
We could have our four amazing speakers get up to the stage for about half an hour's worth of questions. I'm going to use my prerogative here to ask one question, spinning off of something Jag said, which it's interesting. It seems like this is a message I often hear from people in the DPA, that they remind us that while from our local perspective, the connection between cannabis legalization and legalization, or at least decriminalization of psychedelics, looks pretty organically resonant. That from a national perspective, can look very different because of the degree to which people who are more or less okay with cannabis, at least in principle for some people, are still terrified and resistant to psychedelics. And so I just kind of wanted to bring that up because it's so natural, and many of the talks touched on the similarities and differences, and just to think about if that is the case, and if part of what we want is something that's more like the acceptance we already have of cannabis within a broader population, among conservatives, among libertarians, among just whatever, that is there some additional work to do, or is this the place where the models kind of split and we should not try to compare them too much? So just a little bit of reflection on that tension.
Sure. Yeah, something that's easy to pick up in these spaces is there's a certain psychedelic exceptionalism that often seems to pervade these people, these kind of events. And I think it's important to realize that the reason any drug got made illegal in the first place was not based on any science. But when you look at the public support for, say, legalizing psychedelics, it's very low. It's down there around 10-15%, similar to heroin or methamphetamine. We did some internal messaging research last year to figure out if we're gonna popularize drug decriminalization in the US, where are different segments of the population at, and what are their underlying beliefs and values driving that, and where can we shift it? And one of the interesting things, one of the questions was, do you think the following drugs can be used safely and in moderation? And less than 20% of a representative sample of the US public thought that MDMA or psychedelics could be used safely and in moderation. So I think that shows that even if something's approved in a medical context, it doesn't necessarily mean that the myths that underlie its criminalization are going to be completely shattered. And we can't just assume that. I think there's an assumption, because marijuana went from medical marijuana to marijuana legalization, that that it's a linear path, and it actually wasn't that linear. There were a lot of decriminalization efforts in the 70s before that. And it's not inevitable that if something gets medicalized, that it's going to become decriminalized and normalized and accepted by society. We can't kind of take that for granted.
Yeah, so I think the best way to respond to this is by differentiating the kind of public opinion shifts that are needed for policy change, and again, kind of what I was talking about around culture change. And I think that one of the kind of examples that Rick cites a lot when we're talking about the process of going from medicalization to decriminalization with marijuana is that it wasn't, that one of the most significant factors was knowing someone, for people to change their opinions, knowing someone who had used or uses medical marijuana. And I think that that's an interesting piece, because people aren't asking their friends or family or colleagues, are like, so how like, through what legal system is the medicine you're getting happening? I don't think most people don't care whether there's like a federal process that's fully legalizing something, or it's like just a system that allows them to buy it at a store down the street, like you see with medical use in the United States. So I think that part of the experiment that's happening with now around this kind of arc that you're talking about, medicalization to legalization, is seeing exactly if and how the public policy shift that occurs, or the public perception shift that occurs when we're surrounded by people who have experiences that are legal, that are beneficial, that are done in that context, can actually impact stigma at a larger level that can then impact the scheduling independently of the FDA process. And I think that does remain to be seen. I totally agree that it's kind of an experiment. And I think that if what we're looking at is, if we're going in the direction of decriminalization and fear of penalties, that's why the medicalization and decriminalization conversation really have to happen in parallel. Because it's like, if the perception and stigma is changing, then that makes it harder and harder to justify a false dichotomy between the medical use of a substance and another. Obviously, we do it, like Jack said, Adderall and meth, we really, really do it. We really do enforce these false dichotomies. But I think that even though the Controlled Substances Act and the process of criminalization was and is definitely not based on science, the fact that we have enough actors that have said that they've relied on science for enough time means that we're getting to a point where we can hold them accountable to that. That is really optimistic of me to say, but I do think that it's a possibility.
Okay, I think we'll open it up. So there's a question over here. Do we have a roving mic or? Yeah, same note.
Hello. So yesterday I was super excited. I was like, oh, I'm a therapist. I'm gonna get into this, right? And then I heard your presentation. I'm sorry I didn't catch your name. And it was like, oh, the government is gonna be doing internal audits and X, Y, and Z. And I was like, oh, fuck no, right? Because if it's like me, a black woman, and 2 white women, and 3 white men, and another white passing person of color, like any negative thing that's gonna happen is gonna happen to me. And everyone's hearts can be with me, and that's wonderful, and GoFundMe, and I have kids, and I have a family, and I don't want that shit, right? So, just being real. So, I do have questions about how much government oversight is gonna be happening for therapists who engage in this, client confidentiality and client protection. I already work with pretty sensitive populations in terms of, queer people of color and sex workers and stuff like that. I don't want any of my clients being on any registry. I don't want the government looking at me at all. I'd rather they don't know that I exist. And if I'm exposing myself to them knowing I'm existing, will they be able to look at my practice outside of what I do when it comes to any sort of psychedelic research? And these are just questions that need to be answered. Because for me, it's really dangerous for the government to know that I'm a person.
I think that Thank you for that question. I think it's a really important question, and I kind of emphasize those parts of it even when I was talking, because I think it's important for just to be real about what it could look like. But I think the regulation is going to happen much more around the drug being delivered to the Schedule I license holder. So you don't have to be the Schedule I license holder, right? You can work in a clinic where there's a physician, that's the Schedule I license holder. They're the one that is accountable, and those are the records that are going to be checked, right? And it's going to be on us to make sure that we're only selling to a Schedule I license holder, and that person is working with people that are trained and that are doing this in a responsible way. HIPAA is there to also help protect your clients. DEA doesn't care about looking at your patient records. They just care about diversion, really. That's what they care about. And these are going to be given in a setting that is not take home. And, hopefully that's just the first step. And, the regulation, hopefully, as it goes out into the world and we show it's done responsibly and safely, and these are other pathways of decriminalization that are hopefully happening in parallel, that it becomes, easier to do this. But I just wanted people to be realistic and expect that at the beginning, there's going to be a lot of attention on how this rolls out. So I think that there are ways for you to do this and feel safe. And you don't have to be the one that's on the paperwork, really, you know? Is that better? Yep. Great.
And so I just add one thing that you mentioned in your talk that you did mention right now is that once it's legal, it won't be a Schedule I license anymore, which means that the oversight is going to be closer to the 2 through 5 license, which is already significantly decreased in the Schedule I license, and then you have the other protections. Yeah.
Right. So anybody that already works with Schedule 2 through 5 substances, it should be along those same lines of oversight.
All right, next question over here. We're going to have the mic running your way.
Thank you so much. So I'm with SSDP, and I've been a medical cannabis activist for about 5 years because of my experience successfully treating autoimmune disease with cannabis for the last 9 years. And as we've seen, marijuana be legalized and regulated in various different states with a different patchwork of laws and different lists of qualifying conditions for people to get access. In DC, I'm a card-carrying medical cannabis patient. In another state, I'm not sick enough. That brings me to psychedelics and how will it be decided which conditions qualify for safe access when diagnosing mental illness is sometimes very nebulous?
So we have to go through the process of getting it approved for one indication. People can be doing research on other indications and putting that out there, publishing it. That is one of the best ways to move this forward into more areas, because then it protects people that can prescribe off-label. And then also, it's, for us, we have to do all of these measures, the caps, to measure and make sure people are severe enough for PTSD. But one of the things that we've really tried to do is make sure that we're not trying to get an approval for just treatment-resistant PTSD. It's PTSD in general. And that in clinical practice, how many people give the caps before they decide somebody's got PTSD? Right? That won't be required either. So it's going to be a clinician's decision of who has PTSD in the same way that you would normally go about deciding how you're going to work with somebody. And then also, I just would encourage that people to do more research and publish, because then that helps protect the community of you're trying to treat somebody off-label. Rick, you grabbed a microphone like you were going to answer something too, so.
I'm going to ask Jag a question.
Oh, okay, good.
I'll say one more thing on that, though, which is a slightly more kind of ambiguous or amorphous process, which is exactly how do you have similar recognition of various diagnoses or pathologies in varying kind of contexts. So as a lot of people here, I think know, Dr. Monica Williams spoke here just about a month and a half ago or so. This amazing talk about her phase 3 MDMA for PTSD site as part of the phase 3 MAPS study. I'm looking at racial trauma and MDMA in racial trauma or trauma from racism. And the reason I bring that up is because part of what's happening, and MAPS is doing this in part by expanding this part of the conversation, but for a really long time, the idea of PTSD in the public consciousness was really limited to people who went to war, people who experienced sexual or violent assault, people who were mugged. It's a very kind of narrow population of people who are kind of part of the public consciousness around PTSD. And there's a lot of good strategy that you can build around that, as we've demonstrated. But I think part of what's happening also now is, as we acknowledge that PTSD is really just the point of entry for the deeper conversation around trauma generally, and again, that's a much slower educational process of getting people on the same page about what is diagnosable, what is a legitimate thing, what is a legitimate illness or indication or whatever. So I think that part of what you're describing, part of what we can do to minimize that patchworkiness of access is going to be normalizing conversations about trauma and about kind of depression and about these underlying things that lead to the depression, anxiety, and all these other pieces. And that's a much deeper conversation, but it's one that I think psychedelics really facilitate because they kind of are able to cut through the kind of service level diagnoses, I think, a lot of the time, and get to a lot of the deeper issues that might be leading to X, Y, or Z symptoms.
I think Rick's going to jump right in.
Yeah, Jag, you said that there's no polling advantage to go for a psilocybin-only initiative, but is there a polling disadvantage? Is there more support for general decrim or more support for psilocybin decrim?
Honestly, there hasn't been a ton of polling on it, so all of the potential nuances haven't been explored. I hope that us and other people do that more over the next few years. But yeah, generally, there's not a significant advantage in separating out specific drugs. Generally, an interesting thing in looking at the polling too is that once you start to name specific drugs, support goes down. The more people learn about it, because of the myths and the associations that people have with specific drugs. When you're just talking about the concept very broadly of redirecting law enforcement resources to treat drug use as a public health problem and to not bring people into the criminal justice system and punish them just for using drugs, that's one thing. But when you start saying, oh, LSD, oh, you mean heroin, then it gets trickier. I mean, generally, I think, the marijuana comparison is useful in many ways, but a huge difference, of course, is that so many more people use cannabis, and so it became a lot harder for the myths about them to be sustained anymore. When you have any drug that a very small percentage of the population uses, then it's, people are just, by and large, there's a long history in the U.S. very consistently that's continued to this day of people believing myths about drugs that are new to them, not familiar to them. So that's where I think people who do have privilege to speak about their experiences, it's very valuable, but particularly doing it not in these spaces, but going to your local city council meeting and getting involved in the local criminal justice reforms that are going on in your community, and get involved in those and gain credibility in those worlds, and then talk about your psychedelic experiences. And and that's going to change people's perception of it over time. But yeah, with such a small amount of people using psychedelics, I'm not sure if their medicalization will necessarily lead to the same shift that happened with cannabis.
All right, we have another question back there. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Bast, and thank you so much for your presentations. It seems that changing public opinion is pivotal in moving forward with decriminalization on all levels and medicalization. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on the role of art, literature, music, popular culture, journalism. How can we interface more with the scientists? That's why I wrote a very intimate memoir about our experience with Iboga called Heart Medicine. And the reason why is we came back from this incredible experience, and I asked people, do you know what Iboga is? Nobody knew that I talked to. And so I wrote that book and released it in my effort to help raise awareness about what's possible. So any thoughts, inspiration, ideas, collaboration with artists?
It's an awesome question. Art is great. I was actually just mentioning, talking with some colleagues about this scene in the show Dear White People, where these two people do MDMA. And it's really interesting because I feel like the way, first off, yes, like there's clearly a connection. The way that popular culture, especially Hollywood, TV, movies, kind of portray drug use significantly impacts how people think about drugs, for sure. And I think that the kind of demystifying process is kind of an ongoing one. And U.S. media in particular has this really sort of weirdly binary relationship with drugs and sex also, where it's highly glorified but also highly stigmatized. And we have this really kind of unhealthy way of handling it in general. So whenever I do see positive or kind of responsible or thoughtful depictions of drug use, it's really significant because usually it's very much in the stereotypical crazy, awesome things happen, and then it's horrible, and then it's really dramatic and like not always real. Although of course people have extreme experiences, but I just want to share this scene in the show Dear White People. By the way, if you haven't seen it, it's a very good show. It's on Netflix. It's intense, but it's like very accessible for people of all colors. But there's a scene in the second season where two of the characters take MDMA together, and the lead up to the scene is like them kind of fighting and they're arguing, and then they're like gonna go rage. It's two college students, and they're like gonna go rage at a party, and like all this stuff is going on. You have all this like teen energy, like kinetic energy, and then these two characters who are like really in opposition, their kind of perspectives in the show are highly divergent. Are like, let's go like solve this like the old days, and it goes on to like the loud music. It looks like they're gonna go get drunk, and it just shows the two of them really calmly sitting in couches on MDMA talking about their problems. And it's so good because it's very realistic. First off, because like you always end up like at the loud party and then in the corner talking to your friends, like and like really all excited. So it was really realistic because it depicted like not only this other way of doing this drug of doing MDMA, that it wasn't like just partying and going to a rave. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but that kind of was I see it as a little bit more mature of an understanding of drugs, a more holistic understanding. Well, first off, it was more likely to be realistic, but also it was a larger kind of spectrum. It depicted that the substance could and is used for literal conflict resolution in the show. So I think I would love to see more and would encourage a lot more kind of partnerships in that really deepen the understanding of drugs, and not just in like the Hamilton Morris way where it's like kind of really heady and informational. Well, that's really important too, don't get me wrong, but I think like the popular culture depiction of how people use drugs is really important, and to show that effectively with the pros and cons and like with as much education built into that as possible.
Sure.
Now, it's a great question. When people ask me about ayahuasca and what it's like, instead of just trying to talk about the pharmacology or the visionary experience, I often introduce them to the musics of the different tradition and the arts, because that gives a much more heartfelt and embodied experience of it. And if we could do the same with other substances, I think that would give people a different idea. It takes it out of the realm of the bizarre or the drugginess into something that people can actually relate to on an embodied level.
I have permission to give my contribution on this, because it's also, I'm an anthropologist and I studied mainly ayahuasca, and I want to report. We think a lot of in this binary categories like sacred and profane, ritual and non-ritual, legal or illegal. And I think that what this traditions coming from indigenous cultures show us is that we have to think of other paradigms, like the very classification by which we, divide and name these things need to be rethought, because these are categories that are very like divisionistic and reductionistic. And traditionally, these things are much more mixed. Like medicine is also art, and nutrition is also spiritual, and learning is also fun and aesthetical, and it's blurred. The traditional drug use, Sacramento use, is about blurring these categories and about creating new categories through which understanding our narrative. So the case of ayahuasca is very interesting, because it's just not about we tend to think of the sacred thing. No, ayahuasca has a continuity between sacred and unsacred, because it's us Westerners that separate that in first place. So traditionally, these cultures have aesthetic dimensions to them, and it would never occur to anybody to say that something aesthetic is like not religious or not sacred, that fun or pleasure. Who's to say that there is no fun and pleasure and just aesthetics and tripping into ayahuasca traditionally? Like, of course, that's part of the sacredness of it. And now there's a Brazilian artist that is actually doing some experiments that is super awesome. His name is Ernesto Neto. And I wrote a chapter about it in our book, The Expanding World Ayahuasca Diaspora, that he is creating, like he goes to museums and he recreates like a big snake that has the kinnet patterns, these geometric figures that we see that, Pano groups say it's the skin of the foundational snake. And he recreates these tunnels, and he creates in the museum like this kind of Amazonian feature, and they're doing like rituals inside the museums. So it's like imploding this whole category of what is art and what is not art and what is, and that's very powerful because you take the regular public going through this like sexy, sensual snake body inside and looking all the art, and then maybe taking ayahuasca inside a museum. Is that a ritual? Is sacred? Is that profane? What is that? So I think that there's a lot of potentiality in art, and also talking about regulation, it's like a way to like break these structures that are so rigid, legal or illegal, because art can get away with a lot.
I just want to make one comment on that, is that while Bia was talking about the way that Westerners project this differentiation between sacred and profane on indigenous use of psychedelics, that in Western tradition, acid was already doing that mix. Like in the 60s, acid is aesthetic and sexual and cosmic and mystical, that we also have our own ways of melting those categories. We have time for one more.
Can I just say one more thing?
Oh, yeah, sorry, I didn't see you.
That I love that you published a book after your experience, because I think it is really important to make this accessible to more people, and art is a way to do that. And one of the things that I love seeing out of our clinical studies is that the participants themselves really describe their experiences of being treated with MDMA in metaphor, and some of those metaphors are amazing. And usually I end my talks with like a whole page of them, and we collect that information in a qualitative way. And I also feel like it's going to be really amazing to submit that to the FDA. and I think that I can imagine books of these metaphors with beautiful art coming out of clinical trials. Like, yes, both.
Right here.
Which one?
Right here, into the front.
Thank you. My follow-up question for Amy about the patient registry. It sounds like that is not preferred, that there
Not
would
preferred.
be. Yeah. Could you say more about that, and about if it were to become a requirement to move into the expanded access? Is that different than what's happened up to this point, and would it be cause for like reevaluating whether to move forward with expanded access, given that some people might not feel comfortable?
The patient registry wouldn't be related to expanded access at all.
Okay.
It would be, it's like another program in addition to the REMS. And it's like another level of control of making sure that you're not giving the drug to people more than what is recommended, or maybe a way of tracking that you're not giving it for things that it's not approved for. But really, we have not got the feeling from FDA that patient registries are a pain in the ass for the sponsor, for the agency. They're very expensive to manage, and I don't think that there's so much safety risk, because this is not not so much concern, because this is not a take-home medication at this point, that it would go in that direction. So I think thalidomide is the one that Rick usually talks about, where there's a patient registry, because there's a lot of safety concerns with thalidomide. So I don't think that it's going to go that direction. But if it did, we would find a way to manage it and to go forward. It wouldn't stop. It wouldn't stop us.
Great. Well, we're going to wrap that up. There's a few more comments afterwards from Bia and Bob Jesse, but I just want to take this opportunity to give another round of applause to our excellent.
I add my thanks, and just to say I get a better night's sleep because you guys are doing what you're doing. I'm here just for a minute. I'm Bob, if you weren't here yesterday, to offer a little PSA. It's actually a correction. Yesterday during the panel, Rick said something that basically said that Roland Griffiths supports the notion of Bill Richards helping Compass. You named the name, so I named the name. I called Roland this morning to say, is that actually your view? And he said, no, actually it isn't. And he texted me the email in question and offered that I read the key sentence. This is Roland. It seems to me that Bill is being unfairly singled out, with the implication that he is an example of someone who would personally profit from the success of Compass, like being a stockholder. And Roland would like you to know that he does not endorse the notion of Bill helping Compass. Thanks.
Thank you. I just want to make a few announcements, and I just want to point out that there are a lot of people in the public that should be, on the podium, and organizing conferences is a thrill process of sad, having to bury wonderful speakers and people that, have equal legitimacy to be on the public. So there's a lot of people here that, should be on the podium. And I just want to mention a few colleagues because I think it's networking opportunity. So we have Kim from the Psychedelic Society. She's over there. Yeah. And we have Mike Bergolis from Psychedelic Seminars, if you want to stand up over there. And our folks at Soltara back there, and Maps Table, and a few others that have been supporting on the background. I just wanted to mention that, and also repeat, I was a little bit jealous of giving Rob my spot because I was originally going to speak there, and I myself sacrificed myself and gave my spot to him. So I wrote a paper about the legal situation of ayahuasca churches in the U.S. that took a year to write, and it's in this book. So if you want to read about it, I can text it to you. This book is being launched in this symposium here. So I invite everybody to go for lunch, and we're going to be back here at 1:30. Thank you.
One more PSA. My name is Dr. Janice Phelps again. I run the certificate program for psychedelic therapists and researchers. I've been cornered by several of you in the room who want to know more about that program, and I'm not presenting about that program here, but I will be here in this room at 1:15. If any of you would like to come back early, I'll be happy to tell you about the program. And any graduates in the room who could meet me here at 1:15, I'd appreciate your availability so you could let people know what it was like for you. Thank you.